It was supposed to be a day of pure fun. A family, eager for unforgettable moments, decided to explore a forest reserve known for its lush trails and the promise of connecting with nature. The parents, Mary and David, were accompanied by their 2-year-old son, Mike, a curious little boy who could hardly wait to discover the world around him. The sun shone brightly in the sky, the birds sang sweetly among the trees, and nothing indicated that this day would change their lives forever. Mike, with the typical energy of a child, ran from side to side, enchanted by every leaf, every rock, and every bug he encountered. Mary and David watched him carefully, but for a brief moment, that moment no one imagines will be pivotal. Something happened. Mary became distracted while searching for the water bottle in the backpack, and David turned to adjust the camera. When they refocused their attention on the little one, he was no longer there. At first, it was hard to believe. He must be right there, behind that bush, they thought, not realizing that Mike had already ventured beyond what his tiny steps should have reached. They called his name, first lightly, then with growing concern. "Mike? Son?" Mary's voice began to tremble as they realized there was no response. That silence, which had once been part of the tranquility of the forest, was now terrifying. The search began immediately. They scoured the trail, shouted, entered areas they shouldn't have, but Mike seemed to have simply vanished. The uneven ground, the tangled trees and bushes, and the vastness of the forest made every step a daunting task. Mary's heart raced faster with each passing second. She held David's hand tightly, but nothing could contain the fear that was starting to take over both of them. As the hours passed, despair only grew. Other visitors to the reserve noticed what was happening and tried to help. Local guides were called, and soon a search party began to form. But the forest, with all its grandeur and mystery, seemed to protect Mike as if it didn't want to give him up easily. Night was beginning to fall, and the cold brought even more anguish. How could such a small boy survive alone? Mary couldn't stop crying. David tried to be strong, but his lost gaze revealed that he was on the brink of collapse. The questions in both of their minds were suffocating. What if he got hurt? What if... No, they couldn't think of the worst. Their love for their son was what kept them going, even when everything seemed hopeless. This was only the first day, but every minute without news was a blow to their hearts. As the family fought against time, the forest continued its course. In there, among towering trees and hidden trails, Mike was completely alone. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. In the silence of the night, something, or someone, was approaching him. Something that would change Mike's life forever. Mike was alone in the vastness of the forest. The night was cold, and the wind made the leaves whisper as if nature itself were sharing secrets. The little boy cried softly, sitting at the base of a tree, hugging his knees. Fatigue began to overshadow his fear, and his eyes slowly closed. But as darkness enveloped him, he had no idea that he was no longer alone. Among the shadows of the trees, a subtle movement. At first, it was just the rustling of branches. Then, light footsteps, almost imperceptible. They were there, watching. Several attentive eyes reflected the moonlight. In the center of that group, an imposing figure with broad shoulders and a steady gaze. A mountain gorilla, the leader of the troop, approached slowly. His movements were cautious, as if he were assessing the little intruder who had invaded the heart of his territory. Mike opened his eyes, startled by the sounds around him. And then he saw them. At first, it felt like a nightmare. He wanted to cry, but fear left him frozen. The leader of the group stopped just a few meters away, towering in all his grandeur. For a moment, silence reigned. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. That's when something unexpected happened. A young female, smaller than the others, but with a special sparkle in her eyes, stepped out from behind the troop. Her steps were gentle, almost cautious. She watched Mike with curiosity, tilting her head from side to side as if trying to understand who this strange being was. Her movements were not threatening, but caring. There was something about her that was maternal. The young gorilla, who would be named Amara, approached even closer. Mike didn't move. Their eyes met, and in that moment it seemed as if an invisible bridge had formed between them. Amara let out a soft sound, almost like a soothing murmur. Slowly, she extended her arm, offering her hand. Mike hesitated, but his childlike curiosity won out. He touched her hand and the connection was made. The leader of the group let out a strong grunt, as if asserting his authority, but Amara did not back down. On the contrary, she picked Mike up in her arms, holding him firmly but also with surprising gentleness. He rested his head against her chest as if somehow knowing that he would be safe there. The troop watched in silence as if accepting the decision of their young companion. And so Mike was taken by the group. At that moment, he had no idea what was happening or what the future held. But one thing was certain: he was no longer alone. In the vastness of the forest, an unlikely family had just formed. And with it, an extraordinary story was just beginning. The days began to pass, and Mike was now part of that wild and unfamiliar world. Amara kept him close, as if he were her own offspring. The forest, once frightening and hostile, now felt like a different home, albeit one filled with challenges. Mike, with his childlike curiosity, began to learn the rhythms of that environment. He watched the gorillas and instinctively tried to imitate them, even without fully understanding what he was doing. The troop was a blend of protection and teaching. Amara was always by Mike's side, but other members also participated indirectly. One morning, while the group was feeding, a young gorilla approached and placed a piece of ripe fruit in front of Mike. It was something so small, yet so powerful. The troop was accepting Mike as one of their own. He looked at the fruit, hesitated for a moment, and then took his first bite. The taste was unlike anything he had ever experienced, but it was good. Despite this, survival in the forest was not simple. Mike didn't have the strength or agility of the gorillas, and every movement was a test of his limits. When the group moved, he tried to keep up, crawling over the uneven ground and stumbling with each step. Sometimes he would fall and start to cry. In those moments, Amara would scoop him up in her arms, carrying him to the next resting spot. She seemed to understand that he needed time to adapt. At night, fear still reared its head. The sounds of the forest were loud and frightening. Distant roars, rustling leaves, echoes of unknown footsteps. But Amara was always there. She made it a point to keep Mike in her arms, pressing him against the warmth of her body. He would fall asleep listening to her heartbeat, a sound that somehow brought him security. It was as if she knew exactly what he needed to feel safe. As the days passed, Mike began to explore his surroundings more. He tried climbing low branches, following the example of the young gorillas. Sometimes he would become frustrated when he couldn't manage it, but Amara was always beside him, encouraging him in subtle ways. Once, while he was trying to reach a leaf high up, she bent the branch to help him, and he let out a spontaneous laugh. It was the first sound of joy since he had gone missing. Still, not everything was peaceful. The forest had its dangers. During one of the troop's moves, a group of noisy monkeys approached, shouting and jumping through the branches. Mike was terrified, crying and trying to hide. The leader of the troop let out a single powerful grunt that scared off the intruders, making it clear who was in charge there. Amara held Mike tightly, rocking him gently until he stopped trembling. Mike was changing, adapting in ways no one would have imagined. He no longer seemed so fragile, and something inside him appeared to understand that this new family was there to protect him. But the forest was still an unpredictable place. Each day brought new challenges, and although he was learning to survive, fate seemed to have even greater surprises in store for that little boy and his unlikely new mother. As Mike learned to live among the gorillas, his family was living through an endless nightmare. Mary and David hadn't returned home since the day their son disappeared. They couldn't, not for a second, accept that he might be lost forever. The couple remained at the reserve, actively participating in every search effort, following maps, entering remote areas, and shouting Mike's name with every step. Hope, though fragile, was all that kept them standing. It didn't take long for the news of Mike's disappearance to circulate beyond the reserve. The story of a 2-year-old boy lost in a wild forest touched many people. Volunteers began arriving from different places, bringing search dogs, drones, and equipment that could help. Even animal behavior specialists were called in, as many believed the boy might be hiding, scared, or worse. It was a race against time, and each day without answers made the search increasingly difficult. David, though exhausted, refused to give up. He spent hours walking through the forest with a flashlight and a whistle, hoping for any sign, no matter how small. Mary, on the other hand, remained at the makeshift camp, praying and clutching Mike's clothes. Her desperation was evident, but whenever someone asked her if she thought her son was still alive, her response was firm. "I know he is. A mother knows." The search team faced numerous challenges. The forest was dense, full of inaccessible areas and treacherous terrain. Sudden storms turned the ground to mud, delaying their efforts. Moreover, evidence was almost non-existent. No clothing, no tracks. It was as if Mike had vanished without a trace. For many, hope began to transform into silent mourning, but not for the parents. With each passing day, new efforts were made. Helicopters began to fly over the area and posters with Mike's photo were distributed in nearby towns. Mary and David gave emotional interviews, pleading for any help. The angelic face of the boy, with his curly hair and innocent smile, was now making headlines in newspapers and television programs. The phrase, "Bring Mike home," echoed everywhere, touching the hearts of those who heard it. Despite all the mobilization, doubts and theories began to arise. Some thought he had been taken by a wild animal, while others believed he might have found shelter in a more protected area of the forest. But there was one hypothesis that no one had the courage to voice aloud. What if he hadn't survived? That thought lingered in the air like a shadow, even though no one dared to share it near the parents. Still, there was something inexplicable that kept the search alive. The feeling that Mike was out there, waiting for them. Mary often said that in the few hours she managed to sleep, she dreamed of her son, hearing his laughter echoing among the trees. She would wake up with her heart racing, certain it was a sign. And while the forest kept its secret, the human world continued to fight, unaware that with each passing day, Mike was drifting further away from the life he once knew. Mike was no longer just a stranger in the forest. He had become part of that troop of gorillas, an adopted member who, despite not being like them, was protected as if he were. Amara, his guardian, never left him alone for a moment. She was there to feed him, to warm him during the cold nights, and to calm him when something frightened him. To her, Mike was not just a lost human. He was her baby. But the tranquility of that little world began to be shaken. The sound of human voices invaded the forest, breaking the silence that the protected family had come to know. Search teams were getting closer. Helicopters flew over the area and search dogs barked, tracking any signs. To the gorillas, all of this was a threat. The troop began to stir and the leader showed clear signs of concern. Amara, however, did not want to abandon Mike. She knew danger was approaching, but she refused to let him go. One afternoon, while the group rested in a clearing, the unexpected happened. The noise of breaking branches and increasingly loud voices alerted the gorillas. Amara held Mike tightly and backed away, hiding in the dense vegetation. But the troop's leader advanced with force, letting out a deep roar that echoed through the forest. It was a clear warning, stay away. The confrontation between two worlds seemed inevitable. Amara knew she had to protect Mike at any cost. With swift movements, she took him to a more secluded spot, away from the reach of the humans. However, the sound of voices was getting closer, and she began to understand that she couldn't keep him safe for much longer. It was as if she knew that to truly protect him, she would have to let him go. But how can a mother abandon her child, even if it is out of love? When the humans finally drew near, something extraordinary happened. Amara stepped out of the shadows, holding Mike in her arms. She was calm, but her gaze was firm. The rescuers froze at the sight of her. It was an almost surreal scene, a gorilla, such a powerful creature holding a human child with such care. The two seemed connected in a way that no one could explain. He had developed the habit of sitting in the slow steps Amara approached. Mike, who until then seemed confused, began to realize what was happening. He looked at the humans and for a moment appeared to recognize something familiar. Amara lowered herself, gently placing him on the ground, but her eyes did not stray from the boy. She made a low sound, almost like a farewell, and extended her hand, touching his face for the last time. It was as if she wanted to say that it was all right, that he would be safe now. As Mike was taken by the rescuers, Amara slowly stepped back. She stood there, watching from a distance as he was taken back to the world he belonged to. But in her eyes, there was something deeper. It wasn't sadness or fear, it was love. A love that transcended logic, that broke down barriers between species and made her, in that moment, a silent heroine. And so Amara disappeared into the forest as Mike returned home. But her sacrifice would never be forgotten. When the rescuers finally held Mike in their arms, it was as if the whole world had stopped. He looked scared, but he was okay. His little body was dirty from the earth, his hair disheveled, and his wide eyes did not erase the image of a living miracle. Emotion swept through everyone there. One of the men, holding the boy, began to cry softly. After all, in that moment, everyone knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. As the rescuers walked out of the forest, Mike looked back at the vegetation that was slowly fading away. Perhaps he still hoped to see Amara, the figure who had been his protection and comfort. But she was no longer there. He nestled against the chest of one of the men as if seeking a security that, while different, felt familiar. With each step, the sound of the wind and the smell of the forest grew more distant. Mary and David, who waited anxiously at the base camp, could hardly believe their eyes when they saw the rescuers emerge from the thicket with a child in their arms. It was him. It was Mike. Mary let out a cry of relief and ran without hesitation while David followed her, tears streaming down his face. When they finally held their son, the world seemed to make sense again. Mike didn't say anything, but his small hand touched his mother's face as if he recognized her even after all this time. The scene was one of pure emotion. Mary cried, embracing her son as if she would never let go again. David tried to say something, but his voice faltered in the face of uncontrollable sobs. Those around them watched in silence, respecting a moment that felt so intimate yet so universal. It was the reunion of a family that had faced the worst nightmare of their lives, but had, against all odds, been rebuilt. Mike, however, seemed torn. He snuggled in his parents' arms, but from time to time he looked toward the forest as if something were still there. He was no longer the same boy who had disappeared. Something within him had changed, a deep connection to that place and the creatures that had saved him. Mary noticed this in his gaze. "It's all right, my love. You're safe now," she said as she held him close. The news of the reunion spread quickly. Journalists began to arrive, and Mike's story became headline news everywhere. But when the parents were questioned about how he had survived, David answered with something no one expected. "It wasn't just the search efforts that saved our son. It was the forest. It was something bigger." He avoided going into detail about the gorillas, knowing it was a story few would believe. That night, as the family finally rested together, Mike fell asleep in his mother's arms. His small fingers still clung tightly to her shirt, as if fearing he might get lost again. But in his dreams, he was not at home. He was in the forest, surrounded by the troop that had protected him. And at the center of it all was Amara, looking at him with those deep, loving eyes. He didn't fully understand what he felt, but he knew in some way that he would never forget the mother who had found him in the forest. Mike's return home was not the end of the story, but the beginning of something even greater. For Mary and David, each day with their son was now a precious gift. They could never look at the world in the same way again. The forest, which once seemed merely a tourist destination, was now seen as a sacred place. After all, it had not only welcomed Mike, but had also returned him to them. Mike, in turn, carried the forest within him. He was still a child, but there was something different about him, something his parents couldn't quite explain. He had developed the habit of sitting in the backyard, looking at the trees and waving his arms in gestures reminiscent of gorilla behavior. When he saw images of wild animals on television, he would point with a sparkle in his eyes as if he recognized them. Amara and the troop were never far from his memory. Inspired by the experience they had gone through, Mary and David decided to share their story. They began traveling, giving talks about the importance of protecting nature and the animals that live within it. "If the forest saved our son, it can save so much more," Mary often said. Mike's story touched hearts all around the world, and many began to see gorillas and other animals differently. Not as wild creatures, but as beings capable of compassion. The couple also initiated a conservation project in the reserve where Mike had been found. They worked to create education and awareness programs, teaching local communities to value wildlife. Part of the funds raised was allocated to the protection of gorillas, which now held a special meaning for all of them. The project was named Lessons from the Forest, a tribute to what Mike and his family had learned in that place. Years passed and Mike grew up. Even after a long time, he still spoke of Amara. "She was my mother in the forest," he would say, with a conviction that moved everyone around him. He knew that the bond he had with her was unique, something that transcended words. Whenever they visited the reserve, he would look at the trees with the hope of seeing her again. And even when he didn't, he felt that she was still there, watching from afar. Mike's story continued to inspire generations. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, and thousands of people began to support the cause of environmental preservation. But for Mike and his family, the most important impact was not public recognition. It was the simple understanding that, at the heart of nature, there is a connection that goes beyond any explanation. The connection between species, between different worlds, united by something that all share: love. During Mike's last visit to the forest, now an adult, he stopped in a clearing and stood in silence. He closed his eyes and, for a brief moment, smelled the earth, heard the sound of the trees and the distant echo of a familiar grunt. A gentle smile appeared on his face. The forest had changed his life forever, and he knew that Amara's sacrifice would never be in vain. In some way, she would always be there in the breeze passing through the trees, reminding him of everything he had learned. And so, what did you think of this touching story? Share with us in the comments. How did you feel upon learning about Amara's sacrifice and Mike's reunion with his family? Do you believe that animals have this instinct to protect other species? Let's discuss in the comments. Oh, and if you enjoy stories like this, filled with emotion and deep lessons, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. This way, you won't miss any of the incredible narratives we're preparing for you.